Imagine this. A teenage girl walks into a church on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of place where people go to seek comfort, to confess their sins, to pray for protection. She steps inside, past the heavy wooden doors, into the cool, dimly lit interior. Incense lingers in the air, candles flicker. Stained glass windows cast eerie colors across the stone floor. And then she vanishes. Not in the middle of the night, not in some dark alley, but in broad daylight inside a holy place. This is not a ghost story, this is real. And for 17 years, the walls of that church held a terrible secret. It was September 12th, 1993, in Potenza, a small town in southern Italy. The streets were calm that morning, the kind of slow, unhurried Sunday where nothing ever happens. Elisa Claps, 16 years old, had plans, simple ones. She had told her mother she was meeting a friend named Eliana De Silis before heading to church. Just another ordinary day. But Elisa never came home. At first, her family tried not to panic. Maybe she lost track of time. Maybe she was at a friend's house. But as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the evening bells rang out, their worry turned into something much darker. Calls to her friends led nowhere. No one had seen her since the morning. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. And there was only one place left to check. The last confirmed sighting of Elisa was at the Church of the Holy Trinity, a place that should have been safe. But it wasn't. Inside that church, Elisa had planned to meet someone, Danilo Restivo. At first glance, he was harmless, just another local boy, quiet, bookish. He wasn't exactly charming, but he was polite, respectful, the kind of guy who seemed desperate to be liked. But underneath that mild-mannered exterior, there was something off. Girls in town had whispered about him. He had an unnerving habit of watching them too closely, sometimes following them. Some had even reported an eerie pattern of encounters where their hair was mysteriously cut when they weren't looking. Locks of hair vanished. Some brushed it off as a joke. Others weren't so sure. And then there was his obsession with Elisa. Danilo had been fixated on her for a while, showing up where she happened to be, trying to insert himself into conversations. It wasn't violent, not yet, but it was the kind of fixation that made people uneasy. So when Elisa mentioned that she was going to meet him inside the church that morning, her friend Eliana De Silis was worried. She had been with Elisa earlier that day. She even walked her to the church doors, but she didn't go inside. That moment would haunt her forever. Inside, Elisa met with Danilo. We don't know exactly what was said. We don't know how long she was there. What we do know is that no one ever saw her again. Danilo, on the other hand, walked out of that church alone. The moment Elisa Claps failed to come home, a sense of dread settled over her family like a heavy fog. Her brother, Gildo Claps, refused to waste a second. He took to the streets, knocking on doors, stopping strangers, asking everyone if they had seen his sister. The answers were always the same. No one had seen her after she entered the Church of the Holy Trinity. And there was only one person who could explain what happened inside: Danilo Restivo. When questioned, he insisted Elisa had left the church unharmed. His words were careful, but his story had cracks, big ones. He couldn't remember exactly when she left. He gave contradictory timelines, first saying she left immediately, then later suggesting she stayed longer. His alibi was weak. No one could confirm where he went after the meeting. And then there were his hands. Restivo had fresh scratches on them, small but visible. His explanation: a cat had scratched him. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but to Elisa's family, it was enough to make their blood run cold. Still, the police hesitated. There was no body, no proof of a crime, just a missing girl, a nervous boy, and a growing suspicion that something very dark had happened behind the church's sacred walls. As the hours turned into days, the disappearance of Elissa Claps sent shockwaves through Potenza. This was not a city where girls vanished without a trace. People whispered in hushed tones. Speculation spread like wildfire. Could it have been an accident? Had she run away? Or was something more sinister at play? The church, the last place Elissa was seen alive, should have been at the center of the investigation. It should have been searched from top to bottom. But it wasn't. Instead, the Church of the Holy Trinity refused to cooperate. The priest, Father Mimi Sabia, seemed almost annoyed by the commotion. He dismissed the Claps family's fears, insisting there was no reason to suspect anything unusual had happened inside. No one searched the church. No one questioned the priests who had been present that day. No one checked the attic, the storage rooms, the locked spaces where something or someone could have been hidden. It was as if the town itself wanted to believe Elissa would just walk back home. But she never did. And the deeper her family pushed for answers, the more doors began to close. If Danilo Restivo was troubled by Elissa's disappearance, he didn't show it. He wasn't grieving. He wasn't worried. Instead, people noticed something disturbingly off about him. His demeanor was calm, almost detached, as if what had happened didn't concern him. But behind the scenes, whispers about Danilo only grew louder. Girls in town began to share their experiences, strange, unsettling encounters that suddenly seemed far more sinister. There was the girl who felt a tug at her hair while walking down the street, only to later realize a small lock had been cut away. Another recalled how she had been sitting in a cafe, only to turn around and find Danilo staring at her, holding a strand of her hair between his fingers. It wasn't just one or two incidents, there was a pattern. Danilo Restivo had a fixation on women's hair, stealing it, cutting it, even keeping it. And yet, for years, no one had seen him as anything more than a strange but harmless boy. But now, with Elissa missing, his strangeness felt more like a warning sign that had been ignored for far too long. Still, there was no body, no physical evidence, just a town full of suspicion and a young man with an unnerving obsession. And when police questioned him, he stumbled through his answers, fumbling over his timeline, contradicting himself. One thing was clear, he wasn't telling the whole truth. But without a crime scene, without hard proof, authorities did nothing. Weeks passed. Elissa was still missing. Her family was unraveling under the weight of uncertainty. And the church, silent, no statements, no concern, no assistance in finding a girl who had last been seen inside their walls. Father Mimi Sabia, the priest who ran the Church of the Holy Trinity, downplayed the family's fears. The church, he insisted, had nothing to do with Elissa's disappearance. But Gildo Claps, her brother, knew something was wrong. He begged police to search the church properly. It was the last place she had been seen. There had to be something there. But the police didn't. They checked briefly, a cursory sweep that was over within minutes. No one looked behind locked doors. No one searched the upper floors. No one checked the attic. It was almost as if they didn't want to find anything. And then came the rumors. People in Potenza started to whisper about who might be protecting whom, about why the police were hesitant to investigate too deeply, because the church was powerful, and a scandal involving a missing girl, a potential crime within its walls, that was something the town couldn't afford. And so, instead of pressing further, the case hit a wall. Elissa's family was left with a terrifying realization: no one wanted to find out what really happened to her. Danilo Restivo left Potenza. Maybe he thought that meant he had left his past behind. For years, he moved through life unnoticed, slipping away from suspicion, untouched by justice. But trouble? It followed him. By the early 2000s, he was living in England in a quiet, unremarkable neighborhood. To those around him, he was just another foreigner trying to make a life for himself. But behind closed doors, the same darkness lurked beneath the surface. Then, in 2002, a horrifying crime shattered the peace of Bournemouth, England. A woman named Heather Barnett, a kind-hearted seamstress, was found brutally murdered in her own home. But this wasn't just a killing, it was something far worse. Heather had been beaten and mutilated. Her body had been positioned carefully, almost ritualistically. And the most chilling detail, strands of hair had been deliberately placed in her hands. Hair, the very thing that Danilo Restivo had been obsessed with for years. It was his signature, a disturbing calling card left behind like a message no one could understand. For a while, the case remained unsolved, but investigators zeroed in on Restivo. He had been the last person to see Heather alive. Neighbors reported seeing him lurking near her home, and when police finally arrested him in 2010, they knew they had their man. Restivo was sentenced to life in prison for Heather's murder. But while British authorities were closing in on him, something horrifying was happening back in Italy. The walls of the Church of the Holy Trinity had been hiding something, and after 17 years, it was about to be uncovered. September 2010. Inside the Church of the Holy Trinity, renovations were underway. Construction workers moved carefully through the building, tearing down old fixtures, clearing out forgotten spaces. And then they found it. A false ceiling tucked away in the church's attic. Hidden behind layers of dust and tangled fabric, something was lodged in the dark space above the congregation. At first, it looked like discarded debris, then a glimpse of fabric brittle with time, and underneath it, something far worse: human remains. For a moment, no one spoke. The air itself felt heavier, like the church was holding its breath. Then the realization sank in. It was her, Elisa Claps. Her body had been inside the church all along, 17 years. For nearly 2 decades, people had worshipped beneath a hidden grave, never knowing that the answers to one of Italy's most haunting mysteries were just above their heads. And now, with this discovery, a dark truth was finally forced into the light. 17 years of silence, 17 years of unanswered questions. Now the truth was decaying in the attic of the Church of the Holy Trinity. When forensic experts arrived, the air inside the church was thick with the weight of what had been found. The body, now skeletal, was slumped beneath layers of fabric and dust. But even in its deteriorated state, one thing was clear: Elisa Claps had not died peacefully. A deep wound to the skull, evidence of blunt force trauma. Multiple stab wounds, a frenzied, violent attack. Her clothing disturbed, a chilling indication of what may have happened to her before she was killed. It was murder, and it had happened inside this church. The most disturbing part, the way her body had been placed. It wasn't buried. It wasn't discarded in an unmarked grave. It was hidden in plain sight, just above the people who prayed for her. As if someone had wanted her close, but out of reach. As if the church itself had swallowed her whole. This was no accident. Someone had placed her there. And suddenly, the bigger question wasn't just who had killed Elisa Claps. It was who had kept her hidden for so long. The discovery of Elisa's body sent shockwaves through Potenza, but with the horror came a sickening realization. How had the church not known? For nearly 2 decades, her body had been there, decomposing, decaying, and yet no one had noticed the smell. No one had heard anything. No one had checked the attic in all that time. It didn't make sense. And then came an even darker theory. What if someone had helped keep the secret? The false ceiling wasn't hard to access. The attic wasn't some hidden crypt. It was part of the church. That meant someone had to have known. And that meant someone had made sure Alyssa was never found. For the Claps family, the betrayal cut deeper than anything else. The place they had turned to for truth and salvation had been hiding a murder victim all along. The church had protected something, but was it a killer or its own reputation? The discovery of Elissa Clapp's remains was a revelation, but it wasn't justice. It was a confirmation of what her family had feared all along. She hadn't run away. She hadn't disappeared into thin air. She had been murdered. And the worst part? The truth had always been just above their heads. For nearly 2 decades, the Claps family had fought to be heard. They had begged for searches, demanded answers, and been ignored at every turn. Now their worst suspicions were confirmed. Someone had known Alyssa was there. But who? How could a church, a place meant to stand for truth, righteousness, and faith, have hidden a horrific crime? Father Mimi Sebia, the priest in charge when Alyssa disappeared, had downplayed concerns from the beginning. He had discouraged a thorough search of the church. Had he known? Had he been protecting someone? And what about the other priests who had lived and worked inside those walls? Had they never once heard or seen anything suspicious? Had no one noticed the attic had been disturbed? To Alyssa's family, there was only one explanation: a cover-up. Some believed that the church had protected Danilo Restivo, that his powerful family connections had kept him out of reach of the law. Others suspected that someone else within the church may have been involved, or at the very least, had knowledge of what had happened and chose to remain silent. One thing was certain: the truth had been buried, and it had taken 17 years to bring it back to the surface. With Alyssa's body finally recovered, authorities had no choice but to reopen the case. But almost immediately, they hit resistance. Witnesses who had once spoken freely suddenly changed their stories. Crucial documents were nowhere to be found. Evidence that had been collected over the years had somehow been misplaced. The delay in finding Alyssa's body had destroyed crucial forensic clues, DNA, fibers, anything that could have tied a killer to the crime scene. It was as if someone had spent years erasing the past, making sure the case would remain unsolved. But one name stood out, the same name that had lingered over the investigation since day one: Danilo Restivo. He had been the last person to see Alyssa alive. He had a history of disturbing behavior, an obsession with women's hair, and now he was serving a life sentence in England for the brutal murder of Heather Barnett. But had he been acting alone? Or had someone helped him cover his tracks for all these years? The deeper investigators dug into Danilo Restivo's past, the clearer it became Alyssa Claps had not been his only victim. For years, his obsession with women's hair had been dismissed as nothing more than a strange quirk, something harmless, something creepy, but not dangerous. But now it looked like the early warning signs of a predator in the making. He had been reported following women. He had been seen cutting locks of hair, sometimes in broad daylight, without the women even noticing. He had fixated on Alyssa, watching her, obsessing over her in a way that made others uneasy. Yet, despite all of this, no one had thought to stop him. Then came the chilling connection: the murder of Heather Barnett in England. When British police arrested Restivo, they found disturbing similarities between Heather's case and what had happened to Alyssa. The way the bodies were positioned. The ritualistic element: Heather Barnett had been found with strands of hair deliberately placed in her hands. A trophy, a signature. It was the same pattern investigators had missed for years. Restivo had progressed from obsession to something far more sinister. But the real question was, had someone in Italy protected him? Thousands of miles away from Potenza, another family had been shattered by Danilo Restivo's darkness. In 2002, in the quiet English town of Bournemouth, Heather Barnett had been living an ordinary life, a seamstress, a mother, a friend, until she was found murdered in her home, brutally beaten, mutilated, and staged in a way that made even the most seasoned detectives shudder. There were eerie similarities to Elissa's case. Heather had been attacked in a violent, frenzied manner. The crime scene had ritualistic elements, cut strands of hair, deliberately placed. There was no sign of forced entry, meaning she had likely trusted her killer just like Elisa had. British investigators zeroed in on Restivo after multiple witnesses placed him near the scene of the crime. When they arrested him, it was only a matter of time before his dark past in Italy was exposed. But one question still haunted investigators. If Restivo had been caught earlier, if Elissa's case had been fully investigated in the 90s, could Heather Barnett have been saved? Or had years of silence and cover-ups allowed a predator to keep killing? The discovery of Elissa Clapp's body inside the Church of the Holy Trinity had shattered the illusion of safety that religious institutions were supposed to uphold. But as investigators pressed forward, a far more disturbing truth began to surface someone within the church had known all along. New testimonies emerged suggesting that at least one priest had been aware of Elissa's remains long before they were discovered in 2010. One witness claimed that years earlier, a priest had privately confided he knew what had happened but said nothing. Another suggested that someone within the clergy had actively worked to keep Elissa's body hidden. Had the attic been deliberately sealed off? Had someone cleaned or maintained the space over the years, making sure she was never found? Had the church knowingly allowed Elissa's family to suffer while the truth remained just above their heads? The church, of course, denied everything. The Vatican issued no official statement. The local clergy insisted that they had no knowledge of the crime. But the question remained: how does a murder victim stay hidden inside a place of worship for nearly 20 years without someone knowing? For Elissa's family, it wasn't just a tragedy anymore. It was a betrayal, and someone had allowed it to happen. In 2011, the law finally caught up with Danilo Restivo. For the murder of Heather Barnett, he was sentenced to life in prison. His crimes, his disturbing obsession, his predatory nature, his brutality had finally been exposed in a courtroom. But justice for Elissa Claps took longer. In Italy, authorities moved slowly. It wasn't until 2013, 20 years after Elissa's murder, that Restivo was convicted in absentia for her killing. But his conviction didn't erase the unanswered questions. Had Restivo acted alone that day in the church? Had someone within the clergy helped him cover up the murder? Had the church's silence allowed him to kill again? Because while Restivo sat behind bars, the full truth of what had happened in Potenza that day in 1993 was still out of reach. And the deepest betrayal of all: Elissa had never been missing. She had been right there, hidden, ignored, forgotten, and no one had come to save her. For most families, the discovery of a missing loved one's body would bring closure. For the Claps family, it only brought more battles to fight. Gildo Claps, Elissa's relentless brother, refused to let his sister's story be buried along with her remains. He exposed contradictions in the church's statements, showing how their narrative shifted every time new evidence surfaced. He pointed to the failures in the original investigation, the refusal to search the church properly, the missing police records. For nearly 2 decades, the people in power had let Elissa's case disappear, and now that the truth was out, they were still trying to silence it. But the Claps family would not back down. they demanded to know. Why had the church refused to search properly in 1993? Who inside the clergy had helped cover up Elisa's murder? How many people had turned a blind eye while their daughter, their sister, lay hidden just above them? Elisa's case had become more than just a tragedy. It was now a symbol of corruption, cover-ups, and the failures of both law enforcement and the church. The Claps family wanted one thing above all else: for the full truth to be exposed, no matter how many powerful people it implicated. And yet, even after Restivo was convicted, one fact remained. The truth was still incomplete. Elisa Clapp's murder had been solved, but justice, that was another story. Because despite the conviction of Danilo Restivo, there were still too many unanswered questions. Why was Elisa's case buried for so long? Was it incompetence, corruption, fear, or something worse? Who exactly protected Restivo? Did his family's influence shield him? Did the church actively cover for him? Or had someone within the clergy been involved in more than just the cover-up? And the most chilling question of all, how many other victims could he have had? Restivo had been convicted of 2 murders, but predators don't start with murder. Had Elisa truly been the first? Or were there others who had simply never been found? The Church of the Holy Trinity still stood in Potenza. But for those who knew Elisa's story, it was no longer a house of God. It was a monument to silence, a reminder of the girl they tried to forget. The Church of the Holy Trinity still stands in Potenza, but for many, it no longer symbolizes faith, redemption, or peace. It is a crime scene, a place where a 16-year-old girl was murdered and left to rot above a congregation that prayed beneath her for years. A place where secrets were buried, where silence was valued more than justice. Elisa Clapp's case became one of Italy's most haunting unsolved mysteries, not because no one knew what happened, but because too many people knew and did nothing. The people who had been meant to protect Elisa, the church, the police, the system itself, had failed her. For those who visit Potenza today, the church remains. But for the Claps family, for those who know Elisa's story, it is a monument to betrayal. A symbol of the silence that allowed a predator to walk free for years. And even though her case has been closed, one question still lingers in the shadows of that church. Elisa Clapp's story is one of deception, power, and an unbearable loss. But there is one final, chilling thought. If construction workers had never found her body, would the truth have ever been told? Would the church have ever admitted what had been hidden within its walls? Would Danilo Restivo have gone on to kill again? Or was this the perfect crime, hidden in plain sight, a murder that could have remained a mystery forever? And the most unsettling question of all: how many other secrets are still hidden within the walls of the church?